Welcome to Leveraging Inspiration, the Inspired Patent Podcast, where we help you understand and leverage your intellectual property. I'm your host, Wayne Carroll, and I'm joined today with David Blackledge. We're excited to bring you insights and stories from the success and failures of others and teach you how to win at the game of intellectual property. I always start with a disclaimer. The information we provide on this podcast, David Blackledge and I are attorneys, but this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. We are not providing legal advice, and nothing in this podcast should be construed as creating an attorney-client relationship. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Today, we're talking about the legal requirements before working with investors. In a worst-case scenario, violating securities requirements can get you sent to jail and get you large fines. One of the very notable cases of this was Elizabeth Holmes with the company Theranos, where she was telling investors things that weren't true. Is that your understanding of what was happening there?
Yes, I think the main point of the situation and the reason she was charged with various felonies was that she gathered investors for the company, promising them that her new machine would be able to diagnose multiple diseases. As it turns out, the machine generally did not work. And the blood tests they were running actually were done on commercially available machines. She failed to let people know, and almost immediately you're expected to, if things are not as they were stated. If she had come back soon after and said, we still haven't gotten the machine to work yet, but we're working on it, she probably would have been okay, but she maintained for some years the illusion that this was continuing to work and they were getting good results. Before investing, you have to tell them the right things, but after you get their money, even if it's bad news, you're expected to let people know right away. And that keeps you out of trouble generally. Your investors may not appreciate bad news, but it does keep you out of trouble with the authorities.
I'll give a real quick overview of the case. They believed they could take one drop of blood and do a multitude of blood tests on it, making it very easy, and that they would actually have an automated machine was their goal. You could just go into a drugstore, get just a pinprick and get a whole bunch of blood tests done, and the results would be available very quickly. That was the dream that she was selling. And she believed she could do it initially, I believe. What the real question comes to, and I'm sure where her case came down to, was she committing fraud? Was she telling people things that weren't true? In the beginning, if she believed she could do it, then she doesn't have a problem. But once she hit the roadblocks and was struggling to overcome them, instead of telling them, hey, we've got these roadblocks, they were actually taking orders and doing blood tests, but they were just sending them out to another lab, not using their actual testing equipment, but made it appear as though it was working. But it wasn't. The technology wasn't working yet. And she gathered a lot of money because it was just such a beautiful idea, but unfortunately, it only ended up being a dream that never came true.
That's correct. Fraud, in sense, in the legal term, is that you knew or should have known that you were telling people things that weren't true. And even after people internally in the lab itself developing the machine said it's not working, we're working on it, but it's not working out, and they started sending these things out to commercial labs, as you said, she knew at that point that it did not work, and she should have communicated that immediately to the investment community, that they were having trouble with the machine. She did not. She maintained the illusion everything was fine. But in fact, all the records at her trial and a number of people that worked at the company said, we've told her for some time now, we're not able to make it work. She should have told the investors that as soon as she knew.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with investors, you're dealing with other people's money. And that can be true even if those people are your family and friends. And there are requirements that you need to meet. And if you take enough of your friend's money or even your family's money and lie to them, you can still go to jail.
That's correct, Wayne. You bring up an interesting point too, is some people are still a little deluded in that their friends and family, they don't need to have any particular type of paperwork or guarantees as regular investors. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that there's no such thing as a friends and family exemption. If Aunt Millie wants to give you money as an investment, you need to be registered with the SEC or qualify for an SEC exemption to start taking money. $1 coming in the door, you have to have some kind of a registration or exemption with the SEC. And even if it's family and immediate family and friends, they still have to be documented properly according to the SEC rules.
Yes. And it can often take a long time for the SEC to catch up when somebody's been doing it wrong. But at the end of the day, they don't let up. They keep going until they do send people to jail. And if you don't go to jail, it may be large fines. So you don't want either one of those.
Yeah, SEC is the pay a fine organization. However, if you maintain the fraud, then they refer the case to the FBI, and then you're probably going to jail to do that. So it's also interesting to point out, Wayne, that as you probably are quite aware, that there's two different types of investors. There's unaccredited investors and there's accredited investors. Accredited investors are, for better or worse, considered by the government to be sophisticated business people and receive lesser documentation or simple documentation in their investments. They should know better, according to the government's mind. Those are people with what we would normally say is high net worth to the average person, over $1 million in investable cash, or higher incomes as well. So there's a test for accreditation. But still, even they receive formal documentation from a company when making an investment.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that comes to mind is the Ponzi scheme, which is over 100 years old, I believe. And Ponzi was a man who he came up with this idea to buy, I believe it was stamps, and he was using foreign exchanges. Basically, he said we could buy these stamps and sell them over here and we'd make money. And since it was like he was buying money, getting a good exchange rate, and then getting money out, it sounded really simple. And maybe for the first couple transactions, it actually worked. But people were excited about this opportunity, and he got a lot of investors to the point where he could not actually physically buy enough and do the transaction. It only worked on a very small scale, but he was excited about having all these investors. Instead of actually doing the transactions, he said, okay, I'm going to give you a 10% return, or whatever the number was. And so he took new people's money and gave the previous investors their return on investment. And then he just needed more people's money so that's what a Ponzi scheme is. And I've actually seen a case where it was labeled a Ponzi scheme and the guy did go to jail. It was dealing with real estate and mortgages. But yeah, the whole purpose of having an SEC in a lot of ways is to protect the people who are putting a lot of trust in somebody by giving them their money. If you breach that trust, bad things are going to happen to you. And since we don't want the mob to be the ones that do the bad things, we have an SEC. That's a lot better way to run our country.
Yeah. When the SEC was formed, the first SEC rules were put into effect in 1933 after the Great Crash. We still see this happening. You see another Ponzi-like scheme in Bernie Madoff. He, I think, was up to $56 billion in money, and he never made a single trade. But on paper, he kept on falsifying records where people thought they made a lot of money. And if you wanted some of it back or a small amount, he could write a check because he still had money in the banks a little bit. But the problem was when a lot of people started asking for their money back, again, as you said before, there wasn't enough to cover it, and the scheme was uncovered. The interesting thing is that Madoff was a very senior person in NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange, and other organizations. People loved the guy until they found out that everything he did was basically a massive fraud.
Yeah. And ironically, the case that I was involved in a little bit, representing creditors, the guy was quite senior. And I believe by the time when he went to jail, he was in his late 70s, early 80s. You would think somebody older wouldn't defraud people. And oftentimes, I think it sneaks up on them. They make a small choice, but that small choice is the fraud. And then that choice has to grow and grow until the fraud is so big they can't actually undo it.
I think that's the case. I think people get caught up in a whirlwind of the fraud and they don't know how to put a stop to it. And the best answer is don't start it. Don't start down that path.
Yeah. And that's part of the being an entrepreneur, is to face the truth. Things don't always work out as an entrepreneur. There are roadblocks and businesses fail, sometimes beyond the entrepreneur's control. And if you've got investors, you need to protect yourself by telling the truth and giving them the hard news. If you can't do it, hire somebody who can. You can get somebody else to tell them the bad news, but they need to know it. So,
in small businesses in particular, especially startups or what we call pre-revenue companies, they look to angel investors for initial seed funding to grow the business. And the angel investors, you look at pitch decks and things like that, you look at a series of slides which tells the company's stories. Before you ask anyone for money, and before you actually present yourself at an angel group or other investment groups, you need to have talked to an attorney to qualify what you're doing and what you're saying. That's the key. I've had clients come in and say they've already accepted money. It's tough to back out of that. You can do it, but the fact is, if you talk to a securities attorney before you ask for money, hear what the rules are, and you're in a much better position. But you should not be presenting to an investment group or to anyone, including friends and family. You should not be asking them for money until you talk to a qualified securities attorney.
all right. Thank you. That's all the time we have for this episode, but we'll be back with more about dealing with investors. I'm Wayne Carroll. I'm joined with David Blackledge, and this is Leveraging Inspiration.